First in the series that deals with evolution. And because we just came off of a chapter that told us something about populations and genetics, this was chapter 9, and inheritance, now we're going to start working with some of the same concepts to figure out how populations in their entirety evolve. And the first part of this deals with some of the main players that led us to a better understanding for what evolution is and how it works. And of course, the first person that comes to people's minds usually when they discuss evolution is Charles Darwin. Darwin was an Englishman who in 1859 published a seminal book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So here is Darwin in his older age with a full beard. That's not how he's always pictured, and that's not how he started to collect all the information, all the data that ultimately led to the book The Origin of Species. But after a long period of reflection, and some people say after delaying unnecessarily the publication of this book, he finally came out of hiding with it, and it was published in 1859. Now, when you actually read The Origin of Species, and it is something I recommend, even though it's not an easy read, but it is a very influential book no matter how you feel about it, it is something that is very instructive when it comes to how science as an overall concept has evolved. Because what he wrote in 1859 is a pretty staid treatise. It's not flashy, it's not elegant, it's plodding a little bit, but there are some very interesting key features. One of the things that happened at the same time, and that probably prompted Darwin to do what he did when he did it, was that one of his colleagues, Alfred Russel Wallace, had the same ideas at the same time. And so Darwin's book was ultimately prompted and written finally out of fear of competition from others. And Wallace was somebody who was spending most of his time doing field work in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and he communicated with Darwin, and they both came up with this idea of natural selection as a driving force for how organisms change over time. And both of their research together was presented at the Linnean Society in London in 1858. And of course, at that point, Darwin realized, well, I better get my book going because otherwise somebody else is going to steal my thunder. So both Wallace and Darwin are whom we might consider the parents, the fathers of evolutionary thought. Now, the kinds of things that they were putting on paper weren't really that interesting to begin with, because it's an obvious thing to say that organisms change over generation time. In fact, during human history, we have seen these kind of changes because human populations change over generation time. Think about the population in the state of California. Is the population in the state of California, population of humans, the same, exactly the same as it was in 1850 when California became a state? I think everybody would agree, clearly not. And so then the question is, what happened to the population? Well, people immigrated, people emigrated, people connected here from different cultures, and ultimately we now have a different population genetically than we had in 1850. So that's clear for humans, and we can document that. But it is also clear for many other kinds of organisms, and both Wallace and Darwin, in their experience with wild populations, had seen something similar. The second thing that's not very difficult to understand either is that individuals with a set of traits, like we do, we can sometimes function better with certain parts of these traits than with others. So if somebody perhaps has a recessive disorder, that's a disadvantage. If somebody has a novelty, perhaps if you're a bacterium and you've developed a way to resist some type of antibiotic, then that's obviously a great benefit, and you will therefore leave more offspring than the others that don't have that type of advantage. And so these are the kind of things that are pretty logical when you think about it, but when people started to apply them to natural populations, they didn't really know how to best put it all together because, once more, just as with Mendelian genetics, they did not have a mechanism. And whenever it comes to scientific principles, it's great to have ideas and great to pose hypotheses, but unless you eventually come up with a mechanism for why it is the way you think it should be, then you are really at a loss. And so it took a while for all these things to develop. Now when you look at Darwin and his work, clearly we can put it into a context in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that was, England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so from a cultural perspective as well as from a scientific one, that gives you a set of limitations. Now, Darwin was one of the first to suggest that the Earth was old. And when he thought old, it meant old in terms of many millions of years. The second thing he thought was that there is an underlying relationship between all the organisms that we see, and the reason for this is that there are so many similarities in form. Structures of limbs, for example. The very fact that organisms, certainly mammals and birds, vertebrates in general, they have a head and they have 4 limbs and so on and so forth. That to him meant that there was some kind of underlying relationship because so many similar forms couldn't be a coincidence. Now, coming back to Darwin's education at the time, there was a lot to be said for the classical type of education. At that time, that meant that people were taught Latin, they were taught Greek, they were reading Greek philosophers, they were reading all the ancient texts as they were available. And so Darwin was very well acquainted with things that people in ancient Greece would have said. And when it came to natural sciences, there wasn't that much out there. But Aristotle, for example, who was a well-known philosopher back then, he thought that species were fixed and non-evolving. Because based on Aristotle's observations, that's what he understood to be true. Now think about that for a minute. What was it that Aristotle saw? He saw various types of organisms in ancient Greece, but he didn't really see anything else. So he was not aware of the true diversity of life, the way we are today, or even the way Darwin was. And so all he could do is look at a dog and see a dog. And the next day it was still a dog, or a sheep, or a horse. And so from that perspective, clearly things are fixed. When you don't consider them over a period of many generations, you will not see any change, because you or I, as individuals in the here and now, we don't evolve. We don't suddenly sprout a second head. That's not the kind of change that you would expect in any case, but still, just little changes, even subtle ones, we don't see in us. And so the idea of species as fixed and non-evolving, that was clearly based on the frame of reference from Aristotle's age. In addition, given that the Judeo-Christian culture gives us a time limit for how long the earth was around and for how long things could therefore have to change, this imposed a serious limitation. And so if the earth is only about 6,000 years old or so, depending on who you read and what you believe, then this gives you a very limited number of generations or generation time over which change could have occurred. And so that's clearly a limitation as well. Now Darwin grew up in this, and so he wasn't somebody who was automatically an anarchist because he was looking for ways out of this particular scenario that his cultural background gave him. But one of the things he saw on his voyage, when he went out and took a boat trip around the world, he realized that there are certain things that just didn't make sense if you only had 6,000 years to do things in. Or that didn't make sense if all you had is fixed and non-evolving species. And so, based on this type of evidence that's new to him and new to everybody else, because nobody else had gone around the world at that time, then this became a problem. And you come back from a journey like this and you have some serious things to think about. The voyage he undertook in the early 1830s took him for 5 years around the world on a ship, the HMS Beagle, and he was actually a naturalist. Now Darwin was not originally going to be a naturalist. He was actually first going to be a member of the clergy, and then he was going to be a medical doctor, But none of these things really made sense to him, and he didn't like the profession. So his dad thought that it might be a good idea to get him out of town, and so he did for a while. Initially, it was only going to be for about a year. It ended up being 5 years, and he saw a lot. I mean, he did this trip right around the world, and there were some key areas, specifically in the Galápagos Islands, shown here by that little yellow circle off the coast of South America, where some very interesting things can be found. So Darwin was very impressed by what he saw. And specifically, the kinds of things he saw were connections between organisms from one place and another. And this was nowhere so apparent than it was in the Galápagos Islands. He made a collection of specimens, and later on, when he was comparing the different forms that he found in different places, he realized that they were so similar, there must be some kind of connection between them. And so he realized that when you look at the species of different organisms in the Galápagos Islands, and if you're considering, for example, here the marine iguana, that's the larger picture here, and the mainland green iguana, they're very similar in overall structure, but they do things differently. One of them, the marine iguana, it swims in the ocean. It eats algae off the rocks. But when you look at its overall morphology and the claws and the head and the scales, it's so similar to the South American form that exists in the trees and in the branches that it's just remarkable. And somebody like Darwin said, this cannot be coincidence. There must be a connection. The same kind of thing with the various types of finches that occur on these different islands. There are over a dozen types of finches on the Galápagos Islands, whereas on the closest area of the South American mainland, there's only one species of finch. Why should that be? The larger landmass has only one type, whereas the small little islands have multiple. What sense does that make? That the smaller landmass has so much diversity and the large landmass does not. Did those all come from the larger landmass and left nothing behind? Or did one come from the large landmass and diversify? Darwin had these questions. It just didn't make sense to him, and so he spent a long time thinking about it. It was certainly apparent to him that there was a connection, and he was exploring that connection. In addition, at the same time, there was some new evidence available in geology. And this new evidence in geology was promoted by a geologist named Charles Lyell. And he said that based on his findings in geology, the Earth must be ancient. Now, this was something that Darwin liked to hear. Because if you are considering that species change over generation time, then it does take a lot longer than, say, 6,000 years for fundamental change to occur. But if the Earth is very old, then generation time is in your favor, and you can achieve all these changes. Now, why would somebody like Darwin, or why would people in general at that time believe somebody like Lyell? The reason is that he was one of the foremost geologists at a time when geologist was extremely important to the development of the economy. Because what they were looking for back then was coal. Coal was the stuff that you could excavate and burn and heat your steam engines and make things go. That's what they did at that time. And because of Lyell's insights, he could basically predict with some certainty where the coal was. Now let me ask you this. If today you were somebody who could say, yep, there's oil down there, just drill a hole here, it's about 3,000 meters deep, do you think that would be a good thing for you? Right? I mean, finding oil is still a big business. And so if you have somebody like Lyell, who time and again was able to figure out how the rocks came together and where the rocks would produce coal, then people would listen to him. So as a consequence, when Lyell produced his big treatise on the new geology, it was something that people read, and it helped make Darwin convinced that the Earth really was very old. That Lyell was right, that the Earth had been shaped by a lot of slow processes and was continuing to change even today. Now back then, the idea that the Earth was continuing to change, that was something very new. Because when you think about where Darwin lived in England, there weren't a lot of earthquakes, fires, floods. All those things we have here in California, they didn't have. Now we can see that the earth moves because we have earthquakes here. You can go to some places in Northern California, you can see the roads fragmenting where they cross the San Andreas Fault, which, by the way, is Cajon Pass here. So we know things change. We get news in a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year rhythm, so we know when there is a volcanic eruption somewhere else. But if you lived in merry old England in the 1850s, you didn't know that. You didn't know where the large-scale changes on the Earth were occurring. But now we do, so this is not controversial at all. And so if you're looking at an accumulation of many slow processes over time, then clearly they can cause a lot of change. And there are many places on the planet where we can see what happened, where we can see evidence for erosion, where we know that at some point the glacier reached down to here and now it doesn't anymore. We can see these large-scale changes and we can identify them exactly. And so the argument then becomes one of what happens to change and what is the best response from organisms to that change. Just as the Earth changes or evolves, that's what that term means, change, so should the organisms that lived upon it. In fact, coming from Darwin's background, firmly rooted in the Anglican Church and the Judeo-Christian background, it made more sense to him if a benevolent creator God would allow his creation to change as the environment did, rather than have that creation perish because it was static. So not only did this idea of evolution make sense from a scientific perspective, it fit with how Darwin believed his God to be. Now, he got in trouble because not everybody could see that argument. And that is still the case. But when you look at it from the idea of what it means to have a perfect creation, he firmly thought that change would be part of that. And so he ultimately came up with two main points. And if you read The Origin of Species, these are the two main points that you can extract from all that writing. The first one is that organisms inhabiting the Earth today are derived from ancestral species that may have looked differently. That's called descent with modification. All organisms inhabiting Earth today, not just the ones that look like us, or not just the ones that look alike, but all are derived from ancestral species, and sometimes those species may have looked significantly differently. Secondly, he proposed a mechanism. So rather than just leaving this observation sit there, or this hypothesis that he formulated sit there, he also presented a mechanism. And he said that this mechanism was natural selection. Now, this is in 1859. Mendelian genetics happened in the 1860s. So Darwin, just like Mendel, didn't know anything about cells and chromosomes and genes. None of that. And so natural selection was the mechanism he considered to be the only possibility before we then added some of these ideas about genetics, which came much later, only in the 1820s. So those are the two things that Darwin postulated. And the question now is, well, how could he be sure? How do you come up with something like this? Do you sit in your chair and just sort of spend a lot of time thinking about things and then you have this epiphany and you put it on paper? Kind of, but Darwin wasn't just sitting in a chair, he was a very active breeder. He bred things like pigeons. He bred things like racehorses. So he was very well in tune with something we now call artificial selection, where humans deliberately select certain characteristics of an organism because they like those characteristics. And then only take organisms that have that characteristic or set of characteristics and breed them together. thus increasing the number of individuals with those characteristics. And that is artificial selection. That's human-driven evolution. And we have lots and lots of documentation for it. For example, when you look at cultivation of various agricultural crops, here is one that you probably didn't even know was there. Wild mustard is what we started with, and out of the wild mustard you end up with cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower. Now all of these are well-known vegetables. Most of you have eaten every single one of those. And if you have, and you remember what they taste like, they all have some similarities in how they taste. Maybe a little bit of a tanginess, a little bit of a spiciness. And they look similar if you look carefully what the cabbage looks like and what the Brussels sprout looks like and so on. But all of those ultimately were derived from wild mustard. Now that is well documented. This is a significant difference from the ancestral wild mustard to something like a cabbage. But there it is. Secondly, we have studied in particular the different types of mammals we've been breeding, because for many of those we have really good documentation. Things like stud books or pedigrees for breeding dogs and cats and pigs and horses and anything else you can think of. So if you consider gray wolves as the original population, and you now consider all the different dog breeds there are, you can realize very quickly that change in organism does indeed occur. We know how we can make that change happen, and we know also how to control that change. If you want a particular change, then you need only organisms that represent the change you want, that represent the characteristics you want, and you exclude the others. That's how it is controlled. And so if you study artificial selection, you very quickly understand not only how this works, but also what kind of mechanisms might be involved. And so these are the kind of things that ultimately gave Darwin the idea that if humans use artificial selection and produce changes within a few centuries, and we're still producing new dog breeds, by the way, you just have to go and look at the Kennel Club and see what's the latest and greatest. Well, if we can do this, then you will also be able to do this in nature by just letting nature do its thing. The only difference is it's going to take a lot longer for nature to effect a change, because nature doesn't pick and choose with fingers and hands and cages and a will behind it. But nature will do it just because of the environmental conditions. All you have to do ultimately, whether it's you or nature, is to pick who breeds with whom, and you're going to get a change eventually. So where does this leave us in terms of Darwin and Wallace and Lyell? They were the ones who really sort of got the cart rolling a little bit. And it doesn't really matter how you feel about evolution and the ideas that I just explained. The point is, though, that it gave us an opportunity to conduct more and more biological research and combine the ideas of Darwin with the emerging ideas of genetics. And that, of course, ultimately gave us many more lines of evidence for evolution. The outcome of this is that evolution has become a very firmly established theory. And a theory in science is something that is well tested, well established, where literally, when it came to evolutionary ideas, in particular natural selection, thousands of experiments were conducted, many of them to disprove Darwin's ideas, but because scientists with the necessary integrity will say, well, even though I was trying to disprove Darwin's ideas, here's what I found, and I guess it works after all the way he said. So we had a lot of evidence in that regard. And still today, evolution is one of the best demonstrated and longest lasting theories. There are refinements. We don't call these things laws, because with laws we think of these really absolute types of terms, whereas when it comes to theories, at least we can make some adjustments. We can create some addenda that certain things happen, yes, but in particular they happen that way under these conditions. And so with a theory, you're able to make some fixes as new ideas emerge. And so based on this, based on the knowledge and our understanding of evolutionary patterns, that is why we are now using biology as an underlying science for medicine, for pharmacology, for agriculture, and for several other fields of research. Without evolutionary patterns, none of this would work. For example, why would we test medications in mice if we are going to try and give them to humans? We do this because we know evolutionarily mammals are very similar and certain types of things should be tested before we use humans as a test object. And we can get a general idea of whether it's going to work in humans as long as it works in mice. There are many other kinds of things. I mean, for agriculture, for different kinds of things in medicine, we know that there is structural similarity in many different organisms, and that's why we can base our research and our finding in humans in some of these other organisms. So it's a pretty impressive legacy when you think about him as the guy who went on a boat for 5 years. It turns out that evolution, which was kick-started by Darwin's book, has become the unifying theme of biology. Without evolution, very little makes sense in biology. With evolution, you can start to see all the patterns that emerge. And that's why it's a really key unit for learning biology. That's part 1.